We demand to know how an officer could feel his life is being threatened by someone who is obviously running away. Was it necessary to shoot Ricky in the head? Why not shoot to maim instead of to kill? Obviously, the officer was close enough to be able to get a clear shot. If the police were completely aware of the robbery attempt the Young brothers were allegedly planning, why didn't they simply surround the house and order all inside to come out? Where could they have gone? If they had come out shooting, we could understand retaliation by the police. But to have apparently set them up so that the situation was allowed to easily get out of hand and have a young life wasted was unnecessary on the part of the police.
Baker is a child killer! 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 Baker is a child killer!
We demand to know how an officer could feel his life is being threatened by someone who is obviously running away.
All right. Yay, History Pub. Right? Yay, civil rights. Thank you all so very much for being here. I am having mixed emotions right now because I would love for everybody who wants to be here to get into the room, but I am so thrilled to see the outpouring of interest in this vital history and really all the folks who are here to honor these women who are on stage and who have volunteered to come and tell us their stories. So thank you all for being here. My name's Alise Canty-Jones. I work at the Oregon Historical Society. We are one of the organizers for the monthly History Pub programs. How many folks have never been to a History Pub here at Kennedy School before? Well, welcome. They're not always this packed, but they are always fabulous programs. We've organized these programs here for about the past 10 years. They take place on the last Monday of every month. They're always free and open to the public. The other organizing and sponsoring organizations are McMenamins, obviously, and then also the Holy Names Heritage Center. And the Holy Names Heritage Center holds and makes accessible the history of the Sisters of the Holy Names, who have been in Oregon since 1859 and founded such institutions as St. Mary's, the high school, and Marylhurst University, and they've really those sisters have been a vital force in the history of Oregon, and you can access their history and learn more about their ongoing work in campaigns such as to make sure that water is recognized as a human right for everyone, and also, I know, right? Yes. And also to end human trafficking, also known as enslavement. So check out the Sisters of the Holy Names. We have a lot of great programming coming up here at the History Pub programs and at my organization downtown, the Oregon Historical Society. Tonight's program is organized in partnership with the Oregon Black Pioneers and in honor of their incredible exhibit, which we are so honored to host at OHS, Racing to Change. It's the history of Oregon's civil rights years, and it's just incredible. If you've been already, come back. If you haven't been yet, make sure you don't miss the exhibit. And Gwen Carr is going to tell you a little bit more about it, so I won't go on and on. But I do want to say that the partnership that the Oregon Historical Society has had with Oregon Black Pioneers has been of tremendous value, not just for us, but I think for all Oregonians who have had the opportunity to see the incredible work they've done. This exhibit is the 4th exhibit we've been able to host at the Historical Society that's created by Oregon Black Pioneers. They began by telling the story of Black pioneers in Oregon in the 19th century. Not just telling, but I'd really say uncovering that story, doing incredible research about the Black people who were here in the mid-19th century, coming over the Oregon Trail like so many others, and they've just continued on in a chronological way to make sure this history is public and known. So we could not be more grateful for the partnership with Oregon Black Pioneers. They're an all-volunteer organization. So if you please join me in a round of applause for Oregon Black Pioneers. I want to tell you about just a couple of things going on at OHS before I do turn it over to Willie Richardson to speak more about Oregon Black Pioneers. First, I want to make sure that folks know that the Oregon Historical Society Museum is always open for free to Multnomah County residents. That's because Multnomah County residents have enacted a small property tax levy that supports OHS and 4 historical societies in the East County. We could not be more grateful for that funding. Thank you, Multnomah County. Please take advantage of that. The research library at OHS is open to the public at no charge for anyone. It's open 32 hours a week. Come check out all of the amazing collections we have. We have online resources, the Oregon Encyclopedia, the Oregon History Project. We have a journal, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, that's now in its 119th year of publication. It's available through JSTOR at the Multnomah County Library, in person at our research library. It's a benefit of membership with OHS. Come read the quarterly and check that out. And we're just grateful for all of the volunteers and members and donors and supporters who make our work possible. I want to say this week is spring break. Some of you may have noticed. And so the Historical Society, our museum, is free to all students K through 12, no matter where they're from, at OHS right now. So another great excuse to come check out the exhibit. And I do just want to say a couple of words about some upcoming programs we have. Next month at History Pub, we will be talking about making home and community before and after the Fair Housing Act. Dr. Carmen Thompson will be moderating that, and it'll be another community-led conversation. Next month is the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act, which outlawed discrimination in housing. Maybe it didn't end it, but it outlawed it. So we have a program coming up on April 8th. There will be researchers presenting new research on housing segregation and desegregation in Oregon history. Come and check that out. That's free at the Oregon Historical Society. Then we have 2 upcoming brown bag lectures on Friday, April 6th and Friday, April 13th, bringing some national scholars to Oregon. And I want you all to know about these. They're free. They're open to the public. On Friday, April 6th, Nancy McLean, who's the author of Democracy in Chains, will be coming to speak about the origins of today's radical right and the crisis in our democracy. It's a terrifying book, and I highly recommend you come to hear her speech. And then on Friday, April 13th at noon, we're going to have Dr. Jason Morgan Ward, who will be coming to speak in partnership with a local incredible scholar, Dr. Daryl Milner, to speak about civil rights and anti-Black violence in America. So really a national and local perspective on that history. So come checking them out. All right, that's the end of my advertisements. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce the person who will moderate our panel and will take charge after Willie Richardson and Gwen Carr from Oregon Black Pioneers speak. We're so pleased to have Alise Davis with us this evening. She is an interdisciplinary design strategist who has held support and leadership roles in various social justice organizations for over 8 years. She's a Cincinnati native and a graduate of Miami University with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, and from the Parsons New School for Design with a Master of Arts in Theories of Urban Practice. Ms. Davis is currently the Executive Director of Portland African American Leadership Forum, also known as PALF, where she works to help our Black community imagine the alternatives we deserve and build our political participation and leadership to achieve those alternatives. So keep your eye on PALF and support them. Please join me in welcoming the President of Oregon Black Pioneers, Ms. Willie Richardson.
Short, and we always have to do something to these gadgets. Thank you, Alise, for that introduction. Good evening. Good evening. I'm guessing there's probably about 200, 250 people in here, and I think I heard maybe 25, so I'm going to try this again. Good evening. Oh, that's so much better. So much better, and you should feel good about that. I feel good receiving your good evening. On behalf of the Board of Directors from Oregon Black Pioneers, I really, truly want to thank each of you for coming out this evening and sharing your time with us. You could have gone any number of places, but you chose to come here, and we are grateful and very appreciative of you coming out and joining with us, and to listen to our esteemed panel who will be introduced to you later. In the meantime, I also want to give a shout out and a thank you to Natalia, the Oregon Black Pioneers Board of Directors, who worked so hard along with Alise and some of the other folks who are part of that committee to bring this to the forefront, to bring this panel together such that we can have a very enjoyable evening and one that also provides some information. I also want to take the time to publicly, not just on a billboard or on a board in the back of the room, to really call out the names of the grantors and sponsors, all of those who helped us along the way to produce the exhibit Racing to Change, Oregon's Civil Rights Years. I mean, it was a phenomenal task for us to pull it together, but without the financial support, both in cash and in kinds of things, it would have been a little bit more difficult for us to have produced this wonderful exhibit. Our grantors are the Collins Foundation, Myers Memorial Trust, the Kingsman Foundation, Cultural Trust, Miller Foundation, Oregon Humanities, PGE Foundation, Rose E. Tucker Charitable Trust, Northwest Natural, Northeast Coalition of Neighborhoods, Spirit Mountain, Fred W. Fields Fund of the Oregon Community Foundation, Herbert A. Templeton Foundation, Pat and Trudy Ritz, Samuel S. Johnson Foundations. We're grateful also for our sponsors, Pioneer Trust Bank Foundation, Prosper Portland, Raymore Construction, the Scanner Foundation. We had a couple of anonymous donators, the Honorable Senator Robert and Judy Boyer, Carrie Krieger and Brian Johnson, Michael and Kimberly Moreland, Zoe Morrison, Thomas and Willie Richardson. We have great media coverage from KGW Channel 8, Oregon Public Broadcasting, Oregon Live, The Oregonian, KBOO, and The Scanner. We also had some significant support, not just from the Oregon Historical Society with access to their collections, but also the Portland Archives, the Oregonian Archives, Thomas Robinson Historic Photo Archive. Without all of this support from these folks, this exhibit may have a slightly different look, but because of it, it is one of those things that cause you to stand back and pause as you are walking around it. And we do hope you walk around and check it out if you have not already. I also want to offer to you an opportunity from us. We are an all-volunteer board. We do not have non-staff. We paid staff. We do all of our work by volunteerism from our board members and from other community supporters. If you have any interest in joining with us as a volunteer in some capacity, to include considering being a board member, there is a document on that back table back there that you can take and scan, and it will go over to where you need to be to complete some applications. We hope we hear from some of you. If not in that capacity, there's also a sheet back there because our work requires some financial assistance. If you got some cash laying around that you have absolutely nothing to do with, it is so disposable that it is burning your pocket. I encourage you to send it to us. We will be able to put it to good use to continue the work that we're doing. With that, I am going to invite Gwen Carr, who's the secretary of the board, to come forth and share with you a little bit about the exhibit. Thank you.
How many of you have already seen the exhibit, Racing to Change, at the Oregon Historical Society? Very good. So that leaves opportunity for the rest of you to get to get down there and see it. It will be on exhibit until June 24th. So you have plenty of time, but don't wait until the last minute. I wanted to mention that this session tonight is being recorded and can be available through OHS YouTube, so if you want to take a look at it again. I want to tell you about just a couple of events that we have planned in conjunction with our exhibit. Of course, we have this one, Women of the Civil Rights Movement. On April 14th, the next session will be on student activists, the civil rights histories of Oregon's universities and colleges. This will be held at Oregon State University in Corvallis. And by the way, we have a limited number of tickets available if you are interested in coming down and taking a bus down from Portland down to Corvallis. The bus is free and the session is free. So this would be a great opportunity to hear about what was going on Oregon's colleges and universities in the 60s, a very activist time then and now. The one after that is on May 19th, and it's a family Saturday at the Oregon Historical Society. Families are invited to engage in the history of the civil rights movement through hands-on art-based activities. So all of these sessions that we have planned really complement the Racing to Change exhibit. And I just want to clarify that that exhibit, I think, is so important for Oregon because it deals with Oregon's civil rights years. A lot of times when you say civil rights, people automatically think about the South. We know what was going on in Alabama and Mississippi. Well, those things were going on here in Oregon, too. And I think it's important for us to know why a civil rights movement was happening and necessary in Oregon, and that it, in fact, did happen here as well, something we can all be proud of, frankly. So I just invite you to come to the exhibit if you haven't already, and if you have, come again. I've been several times, and even though I was involved in putting it together, each time I learned a little bit more. So I just invite you to come and join us.
Hello everyone. Before I get started, I would like to first honor the amazing elders and other civil rights leaders who are not here on the stage tonight. Your contributions are noted, and we thank you for allowing young activists like myself to be privy to this panel. I'm so thankful for the Oregon Black Pioneers for asking me to be here and bringing us all together. I'm most thankful for the women at this panel for all their contributions and for listening and allowing me to be here to soak up some information and sharing that with all of you. And thank you to all the audience members. So I'm going to get started by sharing the biographies of all the panelists. Please know that this is just a small snapshot of all the amazing work that they've been doing over the many, many years, all the things that you may not have known about. They have tons of stories, and I'm sure if we truly had an Untold stories, we would be here for probably weeks talking about all the amazing work that they've done. So I'm going to start to my right. So Ms. Charlotte Rutherford is a community activist and former civil rights attorney, journalist, administrative law judge, and entrepreneur. She was born in 1947 and grew up in the Portland's Albina district and attended Highland Grade School and Jefferson High School. She attended Los Angeles City College, arriving and witnessing the rise of the Black Panther movement. In 1967, she returned to Portland and wrote for the Oregon Advance-Times, a local Black newspaper. She attended University of Washington before enrolling in Portland State University, where in 1976, she earned a Bachelor's of Science in Administration of Justice and a minor in Black Studies. She completed her JD at Howard University of Law in 1983 and also attended Georgetown Law Center in 1985. She worked for several years in the civil rights attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in both Washington, D.C. and New York City. She also served as director of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund Black Women's Empowerment Program. She credits this position with giving her a better appreciation for feminism and feminist theory, which we'll get into a little bit later, In 1992, she returned again to Portland and worked as an administrative law judge for the Oregon Office of Administrative Hearings until her retirement in 2010. Thank you. And to my left, we have Senator Jackie Winters, represents District 10 in the Oregon State Senate. She began her lifelong interest in citizen involvement in public policy, listening to her parents' discussions around the table in Kansas, where she was born, and later moved to Portland, Oregon, where she lived with her family in 1941. She began governmental services in 1959 at the Oregon Health Sciences University and later joined the staff of the Portland Model Cities program. In 1969, she was recruited to be a supervisor of the Office of Economic Opportunities New Resource Program at the request of the governor, and was also the assistant of the governor, I believe, and was appointed to Omsi Button by the governor in 1979. In 1985, she opened her first restaurant, Jackie's Ribs Restaurant in Salem. Over time, she and her family expanded the operations to include 3 restaurants and 3 franchises. In 1998, voters of District 31 elected her as their state representative, the first African-American Republican to achieve this honor. She was reelected to this office in 2000, and in 2002, 2006, and again 2010, she was elected as state senator for the District 10. She also wanted me to note that she was elected by her colleagues as the caucus leader. I believe it was only, one female and mostly men in that space. And she rose up and a force to be reckoned with. So thank you for being here. And last but not least, Ms. Joyce Harris' career has been defined by her professional and personal work in making connections and meeting the needs of communities and educators. She currently serves as manager with the focus of community engagement at the Education Northwest. Previously, she served as administrator at the Black Education Center, a school she co-founded in Portland from 1970 to 1993. Harris she presents annually at the Leveraging Resource Joint Conference through the U.S. Department of Education and has presented at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Her off-hours work with survivors of Hurricane Katrina led to Portland Monthly recognizing her as one of the 25 people that most define Portland. She holds a degree from Portland State University, Reed College, and Oregon State University. She is very passionate about collecting books that document the history and the culture of the African American movement from all sorts of the years, and her personal library, I believe, is 10,000 books, probably, and growing. Yes, and growing. So thank you for being here as well. So we don't have much time today, so I'm going to get right into it. Our first question is really about defining the civil rights movement and activism. So maybe I'll kick it to my right. How would you define the civil rights movement?
Well, as far as improvement for the conditions of black folks go, civil rights is typically how we have framed the issue. But it's broader than civil rights, in my opinion, because that typically leads to civil rights laws. That means voter education, employment, housing, criminal justice. Well, to me, civil rights, as far as what black people need or should have had or will eventually acquire, is a lot broader than law. There's a lot more to it than what's written on a piece of paper. And activism is not just frontline marching. Activism is taking a role in making things better, whether that's culturally, educationally, politically, or in the streets. Since we don't have much time, that's my definition of a whole lot more than just civil rights. I'll pass.
You know, I would echo that it is much broader than what we know, the legal definition of civil rights, because it also takes into integrity, respect, and some of those other broader issues. And when you use the word activism, and I think that Charlotte actually said it well, because it does take in all of those categories, everything from changing of society, when you find that there's something that is not right in the social norm, or a norm that needs to be changed. And I think we found that in the various movements. I struggle with the word activism because there's all kinds of ways to be active in order to bring about change. So, for me, it may be one way of bringing about a social change to another person. It must require something else. I think the issue of the time will actually define what strategies one use in order to bring about those changes.
And so Good evening. Good evening. They're messing with me already. So when I think of activism, I think of it as a continuum of activity. People don't really understand that if you pick up the phone to call a legislator or a city council person to express some concern, you are an activist. Now, there are others of us who you might see on the front lines. You might see us in front of a camera, sitting in front of an audience like this, and that's a form of activism. So I just want to say that activism is being involved in any issue that concerns you. If you call up the school to express concern about what's happening with your child, you are being an activist. Earlier today, I was kind of roaming around the internet, and I found this little, it was a questionnaire that was on PBS's website. And I think the question is, what kind of activists are you? So just for the heck of it, I took it. And what amazed me is that at the end, they kind of categorize you, and they define me as a grassroots influencer. And I said, yeah, they're right, because they were right. But there were two things. They had about 5 different quotes, and they asked you to select one that most, that resonates with you if you had an advertisement. The one that I chose was, if not us, then who? If not now, then when? I find myself saying that a lot now these days. And then the other thing that they had, and there was another list of things, it said, not on my watch. Not on my watch. And so I think that activism is something that you come to at different points in your life and around different issues, and you need to acknowledge that. And lastly, I'd like to say that for me, activism means being a foot soldier for justice, and that's what I've done. Thank you. Oh, and by the way, they said other grassroots influencers were Diane Nash, who was very active in the Mississippi Freedom Summer, and Stokely Carmichael, one of my idols. Yes. Yes.
So my next question has to do how you got connected in this movement. Was there a person, was there an issue that really, I know this is a hard one, that really got you into this? Mostly because I think as we get involved in activism, our pathways are so different at times. Our involvement in different movements are so different. So I'm curious, I'll ask you first.
This isn't hard for me. I think I was born into this. Literally, my parents were running the NAACP and campaigning for civil rights legislation when I was born. And at the age, I was born in 47, the law was passed in 53, the Public Accommodation Act. So my earliest memories are activism, if you will, race consciousness, if you will. I had a friend ask me recently, when did I learn or realize that I was black? And I couldn't answer that because I think I've always known it. There was no pivotal
seminal minute that somebody said something or did something that made me realize I was then a Negro. I was called the N-word as a kid for the first time, but that was just a word my folks didn't use. That was no race consciousness sort of event. And so my parents were involved, and therefore I was involved. They did a lot of mailing to do their campaigning, and as a if I was born in 47 and it was 53, that would make me 6, right? I knew numbers well enough, and I could staple, and my mom had a mimeograph machine, and my job was to slip sheet between copies as she ground out actually a lot of you are old enough to know what a mimeograph machine is. But for the younger folks, before dittos, which you probably don't even know either, or I'm sorry. Anyway, so anybody who wants to raise children who are socially conscious, be socially conscious yourself. That's about the best message you can give a kid. That's how I came about.
Well, I think we, and I'm a part of the chronologically advantaged group. And I grew up with a father who says you can't sit on the couch and complain. That if you see something that is wrong, or you can't just sit and gripe about it, you got to get up and do something about it. And you couldn't have grown up in Portland during that period of time in history and not know that there were things that were wrong. I happen to have been one of the survivors in the Vanport flood in 1948. And as one of those survivors coming into Portland, Portland definitely was redlined. I can recall that we moved 5 times following the flood. I can recall how far I had to walk from down on the interstate clear up to the Lloyd Center in order to go to school. But the things that we look at today are not the things that they were then. You could not have been around in the 50s after and Oregon was ahead of some of the other national civil rights movement, but you couldn't have been around during the movements and not feel that somehow you wanted to be a part of something that you knew that was bigger than you. And I do say it was bigger than you. Whether it was the albino war on poverty that was in, whether it was model cities, but it was where for once that you said, hey, you know what, we've got a voice. We've got a voice that says that we don't have to be confined down from Mississippi Interstate over to Union Avenue. And it was those kinds of issues, and that by this time I'm actually going to take my children out of the school that they were assigned to, because I think there were schools in Portland that were better. That actually, because that was also during the time of the Brown versus Board of Education, that said, we weren't about separate but equal, we just wanted to be equal. And all these were out there then during the time that says, my dad said, don't sit on the couch and think about it, get involved. So I did get involved in the war on poverty, the albino war on poverty. Then I was asked to actually help with the first organized board to create it for model cities. And that became my real involvement.
So my first vivid memory of being introduced to injustice was when I was 4 years old, when Emmett Till was lynched. I grew up in Harlem with my grandmother, and I remember coming into the room, and my dear was sitting in the chair, and she was crying. Now, it's just me and my dear, my mom and dad and everybody. They were military, so they were in another state, I can't remember. which state it was. It was 54, was in Tampa, Florida, because that's when my brother and sister were born. And I said, "My dear, what's wrong?" And she was crying, and she said, "They killed that little child." And then she went on to tell me that they had killed this little child, and they cut off his private parts. And I never forgot that. Even till this day, I can vividly remember that. And then growing up in Harlem, an all-black community, there were other things that I witnessed. Police brutality. How people were treated differently in some of the supermarkets that were owned by people who were not of our community. I can remember my grandmother having it out with one of the meat guys because he had sold her some rotten meat. And then as time went along, there were just things that I was exposed to. I was in Harlem the day that Malcolm X was killed. His funeral was 5 blocks away from where we stayed. I was in Harlem when Martin Luther King came through and was stabbed, almost killed on 125th Street. I remember when Martin Luther King was killed and Harlem rioted like so many other cities. My school rioted. I remember one kid, a white kid, who came to the train station, and I remember telling him, you better leave because there's some other people who are coming and they might hurt you. And I will never forget seeing this mob of kids come up on the train station and beat him down. And that's what kind of stimulated me to be very concerned about injustice, and more importantly, seeing my grandmother, be very active in the Eastern Star and all the other organizations she was a part of. And so I'm saying all this to say to everybody here, if you're a grandma, a grandpa, an auntie, uncle, talk to your children, influence them, provide the footsteps that they can walk in. And that was my first memories of learning about things being done to people that weren't right and how you needed to speak up and not be afraid.
I want to add a comment about the Emmett Till incident. I remember reading Jet magazine, and I don't know anybody who read that article who forgot it. I got an opportunity to go to the Emmett Till exhibit at the new museum, and it made me cry. All you had was the casket, and they'd actually redone the casket so it looked decent, and they had a picture of how it actually looked when they took it out of the ground. And I came out of there wondering, what's making me cry? I mean, this is not a new story. I certainly knew all of what I was about to see and read. And I think it was the 8-year-old trauma of seeing Emmett Till's picture in that Jet magazine that has stayed with me for decades. We'll leave it at that. But that incident is stamped in everybody's brain, whoever saw that Jet magazine.
I also think that the images, and I mentioned, you couldn't have been, and those of us who are part of this chronological advantage era, and the images that were there, whether it was the Emmett Till, whether it was the assassination of Dr. King, of the water hoses of dogs and what have you, and even though they were in other places across the country, they were vividly in your own living rooms. They were, every night. And so not only that, you then looked around where you were in Portland, Oregon, and you also saw, it may not have been the hoses, it may not have been the kid in the casket, but you also saw the injustices. you also saw the difference in the way the educational system was. You also saw the way the employment system was. You know, when I returned from New York and could not enroll in, I won't say the name of the business school, but the business school because of the color of my skin. So, I mean, you look around and you say, well, it may not be the same as being in that casket, but it is the same. It is the same. And so I think that the Jets and the, particularly Jet and Ebony and the TV media and what we were seeing, you know, on our TV screens and everything, those impressions are still with those of us who were there during that period of time in history.
And I'd just like to add that I don't know how many of you saw that documentary on MSNBC last night, Hope and Fury.
And NBC the night before. It was on twice.
It was. I caught it last night. But if you haven't seen that, please look at it, because it looks at the media images. And, you know, one of my degrees is in African American history. And I've learned information that I didn't know about before. So, you know, that's the whole value of constant studying and looking at things and making comparisons to what happened then and what is happening now. When we look at police brutality, I'm sorry, I'm going to say this, I compare some of the police brutality that we have witnessed to lynching. I'm going to say it. Because anytime you shoot somebody down like they're an animal, and then you're like, well, I didn't do anything wrong. So I think that what we need to look at is we are seeing things that are happening today that parallel some of the injustices that propel so many of us to get active in the civil rights movement. And that's why we have to stand up, because if we don't, then we have betrayed all those men, women, and children who got out there on the front lines and risked their lives and even lost their lives so that we could have a humane, just society. So if you don't leave with anything else, just think about what role can you play? And like I said, you can be an activist, and you don't have to be out there marching. You don't have to be, you know, facing down police if that's not your thing, but you can sure make phone calls. You can let people know that you are outraged. See, there's no other word. We have to be outraged by what we see happening now, because believe me, it's scary, but you know what? It's a challenge. And we're all up to that challenge if we just look at when and where we fit in this.
We're going to transition to talking about what it was like being a black woman in the civil rights movement here in Oregon and in other cities, and connecting that to the rise of feminism, which happened a little bit later, but still had a big role on what it was like being a black woman and often having to choose. Does anyone would like to?
As a mother of 4 sons, and as a black mother of 4 sons, my focus was more on being the mother than it was on being the woman. Because recognizing, and it still is today, it's, you know, I have to make certain that my black sons aren't in jeopardy. And so as that black mother, my concentration was actually getting my sons to where they could even get close to the glass ceiling. Because remember, we're talking about the 60s and the 70s when employment and training and some of the issues that we talk about, getting in a Pell Grant, are you kidding me? You know, you're talking about the ability to actually go to higher ed. You know, those are tremendous challenges in those days. You know, I mean, unless you were actually one of the super athletes or stars, you were not. at OSU or U of O or some of the other universities. I think that's why individuals like myself actually do a lot of investment in higher ed and making certain that there are Pell Grants and what have you, because it was not no easy entrance into higher ed. We now, when I look at Portland State University, when I was around, that was Vanport College, so I can tell you how long ago. I said I just went from that floodplain over there now to downtown Portland, but seriously. So, when we talk about, what existed years ago versus what existed today, it's different. But we have to stay vigilant, don't get me wrong, because if you're not vigilant, just as the Pell Grants could not be there then, they could not be there in the future, or just so. It is a vigilance, and you never stop actually making certain, as I said, I was the black mother, but now with my grandkids, I have to make certain that they get access. And it is about access. It's about making certain that that piece of pie is there for all of us, and that we all actually can get a bite of it, whether it is, and later I'll talk about whether or not it's sweet potato pie, but that's okay. We're gonna share?
Yeah, that's the one.
Thank you, Senator Winters. So for me, I came out here to go to school in 1969. I got teased, why are you going to Oregon? Where is Oregon? So imagine moving from New York to Portland, Oregon in 1969 and going to Reed College. Talking about culture shock. Yeah, yours was reversed.
I went to New York to learn how you guys live.
You stayed here, I'd have brought it to you. But during that time, see, I was part of the Black Power movement. One of the things that is one of the highlights before I came out here is I went to high school in Brooklyn, New York during the New York teachers' strike in 1968. And there were several of us students and some progressive teachers who didn't agree with the strike. So we opened our high school. We were the first school in New York City that was open and had an opportunity to sit down with teachers and plan the curriculum. And, it was amazing. But what happened during that time, I also witnessed some of the worst behavior from the people that I had previously respected, some of my teachers. We actually witnessed them physically assault the teachers who went in with us. And so when you think about this attitude that I developed, it was just, you have to question. You have to question people when they're not doing the right things. And when they were out for 2 months, teachers were out for 2 months. And so during that time, students had organized around the city, and when they walked in, we said we were going to walk out. Well, they tricked us. They walked in at 8:30, and we were getting ready to walk out at 9 o'clock, and then they walked out again. But we eventually had a big rally down at the UN building. Several people got arrested. I was lucky enough, I hid and didn't get arrested. But the thing is, as we look at the feminist movement, many of us who were very entrenched into the Black Power movement and civil rights, we didn't see ourselves being included in the feminist movement. That's reality. And at some point, many of us begin to challenge that. This movement should not just be about white women. And so we did challenge it. And I can remember when there was a women's history something another project, and we didn't see black women heroes. One of my heroines is Anna Julia Cooper. She was not included in that. And so I began to say, you know, y'all need to look at this person. And there was one conference, Gender Equity in Education, and I intentionally did a session on the women of Brown versus Board of Education, because a lot of people don't know women played an important role in that. And so I think that the feminist movement kind of rubbed many of us the wrong way in that it seemed to be exclusionary. And you know, if you ever read some of Shirley Chisholm's work, you'll see that she felt the same way and raised some of those issues. So I think we have to always be conscious about who's being included, who's being excluded. And when we see that there's an exclusion, we need to call it out. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to fight, you just need to point it out. And then step up and say, these are the things that you need to do. So that was kind of like my whole thing with and being a woman of color during the civil rights movement. We worked hard. Black women worked hard and still do. And we also had to deal with some of the gender issues. Do I need to call that out, or do I want the lawyer to call that out? Let the lawyer call it out. But I mean, we worked hard. And I'm gonna let Charlotte take this because I don't want to go there right now. I'll come back to you.
I'll do it. I'll be the heavy. Okay, so starting with my parents. My dad was the president and my mom was the secretary of the NAACP local Portland chapter. My dad was always called upon to make speeches, but my mom was physically doing 10 times as much work. Whether that meant the mimeograph that I mentioned earlier, or the other women who she tried to work with to raise money, or the other organizational things that needed some warm body to be responsible for. Your typical president is not going to be responsible for the grunt work, no matter what the organization, no matter what the color of the person, and usually that president is going to be a man. So, with regard to the civil rights movement of the past, whether you're talking the 50s, the 60s, the 30s, the 20s, you name it, women were always in abundance and doing the majority of the work and getting the least amount of credit or attention. That didn't change. That didn't change at all. But it's changing now, and it's changing now when we look at the history of what happened back then, and you talk to different people than the men, that they spoke to right after the civil rights movement when people started trying to document things. There's a whole new group of people telling their stories. And there are a lot more women who are now able to speak because somebody is willing to listen to them. It's not that we haven't had something to say all along. It's not that we haven't had an opinion or an activity that needed to be discussed. It's just that we weren't the ones who were important to be talking. That has changed. Now, when I worked for the Legal Defense Fund, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I was hired to look at black women's working poor black women's problems. And for 7 years, I identified the problems, but I had a male hierarchy that I had to go through to get to the problems. And I could never present it in the way that was acceptable. I did other stuff that was okay, but when it came down to the black women who I was hired to work for, my boss asked me, well, what are we going to do about all these unemployed black men? And I'm like, that's a real problem. I agree, but it's not the one you hired me to work on. So we got issues we got issues with the white women's movement excluding us, and we got issues with the race movement run by men not giving us due credit. But that doesn't stop us, needless to say. And when you talk about activists, this is something that I wanted to say earlier. You can be an activist in a conversation with 3 people. When one person says something inappropriate, wrong, and just needed to be challenged, even when that person is a family member or a friend, you're an activist when you do that challenge. When you say, that's wrong, I don't agree, you shouldn't say that, you're historically wrong. Because most of us don't know history. We're not being taught history. And as long as we continue to have black history separate from American history, you're going to stay ignorant.
I mean, you know, and I passed legislation in 1999. I see my good sister out there in the audience, so she will attest to that. And it was a very simple bill that said that when curriculum is developed in Oregon, that it will be inclusive, inclusive of all. I'm still waiting. I even, a couple sessions ago, actually allocated some dollars, so they couldn't say later, well, Senator, you know, there weren't the dollars there. I'm still waiting. But until such time as we are all inclusive, and until our history is reflective of all, we will continue to have these dialogues and this question. I maintain that the child in Coos Bay should know about the child in Portland, Oregon, that the child in Ontario or the child in Malheur County should understand the contribution, and that we should all know about Maxwell Lumber Company. We should all know that there were black logmen. We should all know who made this state of ours that we all say is great and wonderful, that there were other than Europeans.
So Charlotte wanted me to make a comment about Portland Public Schools baseline essays. So in the late 80s,
Early, mid.
I meant the late 70s, I'm sorry. I'm tired. The Black United Front, which was very active in this city, took on education as one of their primary issues. And after a lot of protest, getting in the face of district leadership, the district agreed to a couple of things, demands that were made by above. One was to have a desegregation monitoring advisory committee. And the second thing was to create what was called the baseline essays, which we actually also said that we wanted Dr. Asa Hilliard, an internationally known scholar, educator, African history expert. We wanted him to be the chief desegregation consultant for Portland Public Schools. And so Dr. Hilliard worked with us and with the district, and he suggested that teachers needed to have a baseline of information about African Americans in literature, in language arts, math, all the subject areas. And so the district agreed to that. And I was fortunate enough in that, you know, I'm an educator. We started the Black Educational Center when I was 19 years old. And so I became the liaison between the school district and Portland Public Schools. And they hired nationally recognized scholars to write these different essays. I was in somewhat of a unique position because I had worked with Dr. Clyde Taylor from the University of Massachusetts, and they asked him to do it, and he said, you know what, I don't know K-12 literature that well, but you have somebody there who knows it. Her name is Joyce. So I was hired not only to be the liaison with the district, I also wrote the language arts essay. And, you know, it was a lot of work, a lot of work. And to make a long story short, we even were able to get Portland Public Schools to release a cadre of teachers to write lesson plans to go with each of the essays. But when it came down to the use, we wanted it to be mandatory that teachers at least use them to plan their lessons. The district would not do that. And so I frequently get asked by people, what happened to the baseline essays? And there was so much political stuff that was going on then. And in the meantime, black kids are still not achieving, which was one of the purposes of having this culturally specific content. You hear a lot of stuff about it now, but Portland had an opportunity, and they didn't take advantage of it. So education, I currently, my bio is old, because I do so many things now, I can't even keep track. But I am chair of the Oregon Department of Ed African American Black Student Success Plan. A couple of years ago, several of us in the community said we need to see if we can get some legislation where we can focus some money on improving education for African American children in this state. We were successful, and we were able to get some additional funding this year. What I think is important, we talk about the civil rights movement. I still consider myself as part of the civil rights movement because, you know, accomplishing civil rights and human rights is a continuum. And we're in a place now where people are trying to roll back the things that were done.
I don't think they heard
and the one thing that can stop that are you all out there and me and all the people that you know. Just like we had kids all over the world protesting guns and violence. You know. So, you know, and I think about the young people. I'm not gonna lie. The young people that got it. When I was a young person, I was doing some of the same things that they're doing today. And there was nobody, like we started the Black Educational Center, like I told you, I had just turned 19. And when you're 19, you don't know that you can't start a school and you don't have no money. But that's what we did in 1970, and the school lasted for 27 years, you know? And our kids were academically at the top of their game because we based our curriculum on excellence and African American history and culture. That was it. And matter of fact,
I was about to say.
Go ahead.
My daughter was a participant of the Black Educational Center. And I want you to know she's got her PhD from Stanford, and she's taught at Spelman College in Atlanta for more than 10 years. She's now the chair of the Philosophy and Religion Department. Her PhD is in philosophy. And she credits the BEC, the Black Educational Center, with her interest in scholarship. Wait, there's one other thing I want to say about the baseline essays. When I was working for the Legal Defense Fund in New York, my area was employment, but we had lawyers who were doing education, and there was an occasion where some of the lawyers had gone off to a conference and came back, and they were like, why didn't you tell us Portland has these baseline essays and all this diverse education, and so on and so forth? And I'm like, that's news to me. So I call home, and I'm like, what's this about the baseline essays? And the response I get back is, well, yeah, we got them, but they're not using them. So I don't know why they're going around the country bragging on themselves, because they really aren't doing anything with them. But they were. They were letting everybody know they had them, even if they weren't using them.
So maybe if we take this a little further, you said it's not mandated. Perhaps it should be mandated. I mean, perhaps that piece of legislation that was done in '99 should be resurrected and require that it be mandated. You know, because I sit here, and as I hear, and I'm reminded of my father saying, you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been.
That's real.
And so, you know, that baseline should be incorporated where young people are having access. And not only that, I find sometimes when young people, even some of us old ones, read it too.
Oh, absolutely. I can tell you mine is real readable. You can, I mean, when you read it, I mean, I've had young people say, you know, because some of the young people, they read these documents, and they said, I liked reading yours. And, you know, of course, yeah. What? That was my intent. You know, and the reason why I have so many books is when I wrote that baseline essay, I had over 100 citations. And I used to get into it with one of our local opinion writers for one of our newspapers. And I had to tell him one time, I said, you know what? You can disagree with my analysis, but you cannot touch the scholarship. Because every citation that's in my essay is sitting on my bookshelf. I lived, ate, and breathed that document for over a year. And
So we have one more question before we open it up for questions for the audience. So please start thinking about what question you would like to ask. We'll have you, if you're able to come up here, and I'll pass you the mic. If not, we can work with you to make sure that information is coming forward. But my last question is around advice. I know we can be here all night. There's probably a lot you can share with us. But are there any advice you would give in particular to women of color activists who are either new to the scene or trying to sustain this work? You're right, this is a continuum, and it's going to take all of us to come together. But any advice in particular you would give to women of color activists?
Well, it's, and mine is just don't ever give up. And I need to say this, because I said that I was in the Vanport flood in 1948 and then moved into Portland. And then you mentioned that I later opened Jackie's Ribs, which started in Salem, and I had some in multiple locations. Probably my most poignant moment and probably my most emotional moment was when I opened up Jackie's Ribs downtown Portland on Broadway across from the Hilton Hotel. And I can still remember, you know, standing under the marquee and the sign, and, you know, with Jackie's and my caricature, and my son and I was getting very emotional about it. And my son said, well, Mom, what's the problem? It's not like this is the first one you've opened. You know, it's not like you haven't done Jackie's before. And I said, and I'm going to say this to you young people who weren't here during that period of time, but you're here now. Just like my son wasn't here during that period of time, but he was here when we opened. I said, you don't understand. You do not understand that there was one time, there were restaurants on this street that I could not sit and eat. For me to come back home and to open up a restaurant downtown Portland on Broadway said volumes. And just as we talked about memories here and talked about work here, you know, I say to you that persistence, 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 and you don't forget. Because it is those memories, and it's those things that you encounter. And it's also the persistence that I think that every one of us on this panel will tell you that along the journey, there will be those who will try to dissuade you. There will be obstacles that will be placed there, and you will find yourself, you can overcome them. I think for me, that is probably when you're doing, you know, the work of change, and it is work of change, because you're seeing something, whatever that issue may be, that deep down in the bowels of your soul that you believe so passionately that you want to change it. And it's that persistence that will help you bring about that change. And it's also recognizing that you're not on this island by yourself. that there are others that are there who are probably having that same heartbeat that you're having. And you'll find them as you actually begin to do your work and making those telephone calls or actually volunteering for whatever. You will find your kindred spirits that are also having the same kind of thoughts and passion that you're having. But just remember, change is not there for the faint of heart. And that it's a long haul, and that when you're in it, you're going to be in it for, yeah. That's why I'm a part of the Chronologically Advantaged group.
So I'm just going to read a list of things that I thought about. Advice. First of all, stand up. Speak up. Don't let anybody tell you that your voice does not matter. Don't go for that. Don't be silenced. Don't let anybody tell you that, oh, you shouldn't be talking about this issue, or, you know, you don't know enough about this to be in the game on this one. Seek the support of others, particularly women, because you may find that you have people who've experienced the same things you may be experiencing, and they can give you some insight. Be accessible, and more importantly, be responsive to people who you represent or whose voices may not have been heard, but you're able to amplify what their issues are. Be willing to share insights and perspectives. One of the things that I found most useful, particularly when I'm working with my young ones, is just kind of sharing with them some information. And one of the things I always tell them, I say, you know, there's some things you're going to have to learn for yourself. And I'm going to let you learn it for yourself. Now, I'm never going to let you fall and hurt yourself. But there are just some things that you have to learn on your own. Be willing to listen. Be supportive. And freely appreciate others who support you and others who are out there in the movement as well. And acknowledge their participation and their support. If you're at, like, when this is all over, you're gonna see me roaming around, because I like to do that, and saying hi to people. And I might see you 2 weeks from now in the grocery store, and you might recognize me, or I might recognize you, and I'm gonna acknowledge you. That goes a long way. Making sure that you're consistent. I think that's what Jackie was saying. You have to be consistent, and you have to understand this is not a sprint. This is a long distance race, and you're gonna get tired. Acknowledge those times when you're tired and you just need to step off for a minute and refuel, and have people that you can call. I need to acknowledge one of our sister friends in the audience, Sister Avell Gordley. I first met her when her son came to the BEC. And, you know, there are times when we just need to have somebody or somebodies that we can call and say, man, you know, I'm dealing with some stuff, and I just need to exhale. Because there are sometimes that you just need to cuss, fuss, you know, say, you know, I gotta just step off for a minute. Just make sure that as you go on this journey towards achieving justice and equality for everybody, that you do it in partnership with others, so that when you do feel your stuff kind of feeling like, ugh, I've had it, there's somebody there who's going to say, come on, sister, you'll be okay. You know, so those are some of the things that I'd say. And the last one, you must study. You must know what you are talking about. Yeah. The one thing that can discredit you more than anything in the world is if you get up there and you're talking about something and you're giving out misinformation, and people go back and they say, oh, wait a minute, I'm not going to listen to her anymore because she don't know what she's talking about. So you must study, and you must study the history. Like Sister here said, you need to know what has happened before. You know, there's a Sankofa bird where it says, reach back in order to move forward. Look at what's happened in the past. And those are just some of my little tips, okay? Thank you.
I don't know how much advice they left for me to give you. But I will say a couple of things that are slightly different, and that is, for one, I was reading about Erica Garner's death and the issue of other young activists who have passed unexpectedly. And the one thing each of us has to be clear on is our own health and taking care of our own health, physical health and mental health. And a lot of times we put ourselves second, we put ourselves third, or however many other people and things should come ahead of us. And without our good health, you really can't go very far. And as they said, this is an endurance test. I think another thing I could focus on that might help through the hard times is love rather than hate. For me, love of black people and love of justice trump Trump. That was unintentional. I didn't intend that. It was accidental. I didn't plan that, but it fit quite well. And I have to admit that I was with the Legal Defense Fund and in the East. I got there in August of 1980, and Ronald Reagan was sworn in January of 1981. I was there through both of Reagan's terms and Daddy Bush's term, and I'm not gonna lie, they beat me down. Out here in Oregon, you don't get the daily news like people in DC get. And he did so much stuff that was contrary to where my organization was trying to go. It got to the place where the Legal Defense Fund was trying to keep cases out of the Supreme Court, as opposed to trying to push the law and expand its coverage of rights for people. It became a question of, can we hold the line? And we didn't. We lost ground. And Clinton was not able to make it up. And needless to say, since then, yeah. So how you deal with burnout or disappointment or failure, if you call it that, is another thing that you got to be conscious of, because it can really take you out and down. For me, refocusing my attention, not spending my concentration on the law and advancing the law for black people, but doing more on the cultural and education side, worked as a way to keep me involved. And I think that if the avenue you've chosen isn't working anymore, whatever arena that is, whatever issue it is, there are plenty of other issues, there are lots of other ways to deal with them. So my advice is, if you find where you found yourself in the struggle is more of a struggle for you than you're able to be productive in the struggle, you need to find another place to improve life for all of us, because there are a lot of ways, a lot of places, and a lot of issues that we can deal with.
You know, she brought up, interesting, at the national level, and you're here here in Portland, Oregon, and I'm at the state level. And I think all politics is local. And there's a lot, for me, a lot more changes we can make at the local level than we can at the national level. Because while she's talking about my side, I'm here thinking about her side, that I had to do some legislation in order to do the sentencing reform that passed last session, a couple of sessions ago, that was actually, done by Clinton, and which is responsible for our prison systems being disparity. And that's an issue that I've taken up because I think it's injustice. It's totally injustice to, you know, where we have, and I was commenting earlier that we can take and track from our foster care system all the way in to the Department of Corrections. So that's become and I really do miss my sister. And my sister, which she mentioned, Senator Gordley, out there. So periodically I will say from United, I do Joint Ways and Means, and so did she. And so periodically I would say, well, if the senator was here, she would say, and I know she would say it, because, you know, the whole issue, when it's denied for one of us, it's denied for all of us. And we have to remember that. Whatever issue that you decide that you want to actually become involved with, think of it in its global sense. If housing discrimination exists, it exists for you too. I know sometimes we don't think that way, but we need to think that way. Because what exists for one ultimately exists for all. So when we talk about this whole issue of civil rights and human rights, we're all talking about living in a society where we all have the dignity, the respect, and those freedoms, as I would say it, I can live where I want to live if I can afford to, or I can have that job if I qualify for it. I can be admitted to a hospital without having indignities. You know, it is about how we respect each other. It is about taking off these blinders that have blind us against each other. You know, and I sat here and I thought it is about me as the grandmother making certain that my grandchildren, and they're growing up, that they don't come up with the same biases that we've seen in our generations. And it is about the thing that says, you know what, I do have a voice, and I can bring about change, and I can allow my voices be heard. But more importantly, that this is a society that I want, not a society that existed 50, 60 years ago, but a society of now. And so as this female activist, and guys, we'll bring you along with us too.
There's one last thing that I just want to comment on. I'm also a member of the Albina Ministerial Alliance Coalition for Justice and Police Reform. And, you know, we were the group that was able to get the Department of Justice to come in and do an audit of Portland police patterns and practices. And what they found is that they used violence against particularly people who had mental illnesses. But we also know that there are many black mothers and grandmothers who are still mourning the loss of their children. And that brings to mind for me the young man who was just shot in California last week, Stephon Clark. But the other thing that has surfaced over the years, there wasn't a lot of attention being paid to the black women who have been killed by the police. I think Sandra Bland kind of came, you know, because it happened during a time where there were other shootings that were happening. So allies, you need to join us as we focus on the shootings that have happened, and particularly looking at the black women who have not only been shot and killed, but looking at the black women who are the survivors in families where they've lost a son, a grandmother. We had a forum last year, and this lady got up and she said, "My name is Sylvia Hayes, and I'm Quanice Hayes' grandmother, great-grandmother." This woman had walked all the way from North Portland to Maranatha Church to be there. And they had a rally last night for this young man who was killed in Sacramento. His grandmother was there because she spoke. So that's one thing that the disproportionate incarceration, the disproportionality in police killings, that even though we have grand juries that say they're justified, we don't have to buy that. We need to question that. So I just wanted to put that out there because it is on my heart, and it's part of that civil rights.
I want to thank you all for allowing us to hold space during this evening. I know we're a little bit over time, but as revolutionaries, we're always on time. So I want to thank you for holding space. I want to pass it over to see. I don't know if we have time for questions. We may not. So I'm going to pass it to the. Oh, sorry.
I'm trying to assist if you want to.
Oh yeah. Do we do have time for questions?
Yes. Yeah. I think we need to clear out of the room by 9 o'clock.
Oh, we have time.
So if people have questions, and especially if people have questions and not statements, unless you're like Gabe Gordo, then you can say what you want.
If you're an elder, you can say anything you want. I'll pass this to you.
What we're going to do is ask folks who have questions to come on up and use the microphone so everybody can hear you. And if you don't have questions, then I'll just pass it back up.
And they can get in touch with us after this, Liza, because we're going to be mailing around.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you.
If we do not get a chance to answer all the questions, you said that you have some time afterwards, so feel free to grab us.
Hello, thank you so much for sharing all your stories and wisdom. And thank you for mentioning Quantas Hayes. I'm a teacher at Roosevelt High School, and I'm hearing about a teacher at Ockley Green who just got suspended, one of the few male black teachers in Portland. He was involved in a student action. They went out in the streets, and now he is suspended. And his principal, who was there, instead of being part of a witness to the investigation, she led the investigation. I'm so disturbed by this, and I just wonder if you have any advice for people to try and figure out how to activate and take some steps to support this rare black teacher we have in Portland Public Schools.
So I didn't hear all of it. You're the principal? No, you're not the principal, are you?
I teach over at Roosevelt High School, but a teacher at Ockley Green was involved in an event. The students went out in the streets and
did a die-in.
Yeah, they're putting
Martin
it all
Luther
on
King
this one
Boulevard,
teacher.
right?
I'm sorry,
On
what?
Martin Luther King Boulevard. I think that we probably are going to reserve any comments on that because I don't have all the information. I really don't have all the facts about that. I do know that I've seen their parents who started a petition to reinstate him, but earlier today there was a black parent who was very upset that had happened. So I would not like to make a comment because I don't have all the information.
Hi. I didn't take this out. So you guys mentioned earlier how a lot of the work in the civil rights movement was done by women, but they weren't recognized. Because of Charlotte's mother's record keeping, I'm able to see a lot of names that are in her records. Mrs. Weeks, Mrs. Unthink, Beatrice Kennedy, I can go on and on. I'm wondering if you could speak specifically to women in your mother's or your grandmother's generation here in Portland whose names might not be in the records, but we can do research on and find more about and should know more about.
I can mention one, Viessa Loving. Viessa Loving for sure.
And I could mention Judge Mercedes Diaz.
Melissa, are you asking how do you find other women? Is that your question?
That or to speak to women, give us a little bit about them, if there's somebody that we should know about.
Oh, you're asking either how to find or give you names, either one?
But a little bit more than names, like who were they, what did they do, like why aren't they in the records?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a better approach might be to ask organizations or churches to nominate people who they think should be recognized and why they think they should be recognized, I think you'll get a broader group of people, women, whose names we might not sit here and think about, but who are every bit as important as somebody we could name. So I think you need to ask groups, whether they're women's groups, church groups, some other kind of way of approaching groups, to ask who in the past or present do they think need more recognition than they've received.
I just wanted to know, where can we read those essays that you talked about? Are they available?
Can you repeat that?
I think you can find them online, the Portland Baseline, African American Baseline essays. They're online, and I should tell you that in putting them online, they lost some of the accuracy. Yeah. But that's where you can find them. And you probably can go down to the district and see if they have hard copies. They're in binders about this thick.
Okay,
So
thank you.
that's what I would suggest.
You could be real activists tonight if you go down to the district and ask them to actually implement them. Just saying.
I was hoping you could speak to a particular point of education and civil rights in Portland. I grew up here, and I was fortunate that I went to, I guess, 1981. In its first year, it was called the New Middle School, and then halfway through it, we voted on it, and it was named Tubman. How that school, that magnet school, came to be that I got to participate in as a youth.
So just to make sure I have it, you said you wanted to know how Tubman was started?
How that school came to be. It was a magnet school. It was specifically inclusive. The students voted on the name, which means that we got an education about Black history that I know that a lot of other students didn't get, so that we could make at least an attempt at informed choice of the name that was going to represent that place. Harriet Tubman Middle School.
Middle school.
Harriet Tubman Middle School, 1981. It was initially called the New Middle School.
Yeah, it's hard to hear because the echo is killing me. Okay, so Harriet Tubman Middle School, for those of you who don't know the history, prior to Harriet Tubman Middle School, there was no middle school in the African American community. Once our children got out of 5th grade, they were bussed out. And so once again, led by the Black United Front, to demand that the district create a middle school in Northeast Portland. And for a period of time, the school was over in the where Revolution Hall is now. Anyway, that's where it was. And so the community kept the pressure on, and eventually the school was located over there on Flint Avenue. And the community came up with, it should be named after Harriet Tubman. And what's really interesting is that it went through a couple of transitions, and this year, or last year, the community, under the leadership of Ronnie Herndon and Tony Hobson and some other folks, decided to say to the district, we need Harriet Tubman back. And so at first the district said, no, we can't do it this year, there's not enough time. There was enough pressure put on the district that Harriet Tubman Middle School will be opening in September of this year. Yes. So that's how it came about, and we were very proud of that as a community, because once again, we had successfully advocated for education that was going to be meaningful for our African American students and other students, who came.
Actually, and she said, and other students, because the more collective that we are, the more we all benefit.
Good evening, Richard Gilliam, community member. Hi, how are you? First of all, I just wanted to say, I just want to honor Senator Gordley, and all you panelists. You are the epitome of strong, thoughtful Black women. You're the cornerstone of our community. Thank you. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll get right to, it struck me when you had your discussion, when you were talking about the lack of inclusiveness with the feminist movement and Black females, it struck me that similarly, there was a lack of inclusiveness within the Black Power movement, Black Panther movement, of Black females. Even though we had, Mrs. Cleaver, we had in the, periphery there involved with the movement, Angela Davis, but I always wondered if it was being around Black women all my life, born from a Black woman, knowing the nature of Black women, I always said to myself, wow, how was that navigated within the movement? Because we know that, Black men, for the most part, by the dominant culture, was being disenfranchised. Was the reason why that misogyny was tolerated was knowing that knowledge of what we as Black men were experiencing in the larger culture. So I always wondered that, as I read history books. But more specifically, because I want the next person to get their chance, I thought about the 50s. We had your discussion, and you're talking about the civil rights movement in the 50s in Oregon. Knowing that Oregon was one of the last states to ratify the 13th Amendment, was there, in fact, any sort of community movement that precipitated that? Was that done? I know a lot of your comments were indicative of critical race theory. Do you believe it was because of some sort of, was it just because of their benevolence, or was it because of community action that was pushing them there? Was it just the law, that because the law is the right thing to do? What made Oregon finally make that move as being one of the last states in the country to ratify this amendment, which we know is very important relative to our imprisonment? We see it in mass incarceration now, relative to the 13th Amendment. So just your thoughts on that in the 50s and what precipitated that change constitutionally.
And you talk about we didn't have Senator Gordley or myself then in the 50s. Hi, sister. But the 50s, I preface my comments by saying that 1948 was the Vanport flood, which was the second largest city in the state of Oregon. It was not Portland. And so you had individuals who came into Vanport that were in the shipyards. It was not viewed at that time of being a permanent housing and what have you. Was viewed as temporary. The flood then, of course, created a whole different dynamic for Oregon, including redlining, which housing, and probably Charlotte can address this more than I, because the Portland community, was suddenly faced with having all these individuals from all over the country, the South and the Midwest, that suddenly was invading Portland. And suddenly housing and employment, to me during that period of time was one of the biggest issues that we were faced with. Why the ratification, I cannot address. We were kind of proud that between the Rutherfords and Ulysses Plummer and others, and Mrs. Smith and those who actually were involved in making certain that the Fair Housing and Accommodation Act of 1953 was signed. So, Oregon kind of felt pretty good about saying that now you could lay your head upon a pillow, because Marian Anderson could not. I thought it was awful quiet out there in this theater. But the history of the state does not have a very good history as it talked about race relationships. It's just been, we've bit by bit have looked at city ordinances that says that, in African American, they still had sundown laws on the books. And so, let alone the ratification of the 13th. I'm going to let our good legal scholar, she probably has more on the 13th. But the issue on the disparity, and since you mentioned it, that issue did not happen in the 50s. That issue is an issue that is resulting in the drug policy across this country. Now let's put it in perspective. You know, I came back in, I started in Salem in 1969. You know, when Governor McCall, in the McCall administration. And I told the story earlier that one of the policy staff would say, "You need to go to the Capitol building, Jackie, so they get to know you." And I said, "They know I'm here." Well, it's true, because there wasn't any other faces that looked like me at the Capitol. But the policy that has to do with the public safety system and the incarceration system, that policy exists across this country, the disparate, because of the drug policy. The drug policy that said that if you are in a black urban setting and you're caught with certain drugs, the time that you receive will be a lot greater than if you are in an urban white community. That was the policy that I changed last session for Oregon. Oregon was one of the last of two states, Louisiana was the other one, that we still had manual grand jury recordings. We passed laws the session before last to change that. So now we don't use yellow line paper. We actually are in the high-tech system. But there are some things, they're laughing at me up here, but that's okay. But there are some things that, you know, that there's some of us. And it was part of the group, and I talked to the young women, and I can't emphasize anymore of how you can become involved. The Safety and Justice, that particular organization was very instrumental in working down in Salem to help me get the votes that I needed in order to pass some of the reform legislation. And so there are organizations not only that you can get involved with if that's a passion of yours, and you know, they will give you a lot of work to do to come down, and whether it's education, whether it's law and justice, whether it is foster care. Well, I believe we've got a group for everything, and even if we don't have one, we can figure one out.
We're going to have two more questions from the folks in line here, and then a quick comment from one person, and then we'll have to wrap it up. So.
Oh, I just want to say thank you so much for hosting this tonight and for your attendance here as panelists. I've been really honored to be in attendance. And I consider myself an outsider. And I have seen over the years, in my view of history, of the violence against black individuals. And in the past, I always kind of had it cloaked with the KKK, and that's kind of contained to that. So, you know, that organization was the white violence against black people. And in today, I'm realizing it's not just contained to the KKK. They're not in the forefront anymore, but we're still seeing the brutality against black people. It's not, quote unquote, contained. I'm still seeing violence and racism. So my question is, so are we in the same place as we were before, but now we don't have a name to put on it? How do you replace that and make, you know, you just change the name of it, but the violence is the same? So I'm just curious of your thoughts about that.
So we still have the same sentiments that created the Ku Klux Klan with us, whether they call themselves skinheads, white supremacists, Nazis. They still have the same degree of hatred and violence toward particularly African Americans. There was a report that came out about a week ago about the racial violence in Eugene, Oregon, and that those who are most victimized are African Americans, so it's based on race. Yes. If you look at the Southern Poverty Law Center, they document all this racial violence, and there is clearly an increase in racial violence in this part of the country. As a matter of fact, there's even a call out by these groups to tell people to come to the Northwest because they want to take it over. Now, we all know they tried that once before. You know, we had a killing here of an Ethiopian brother, Mulugeta Sarah. And the folks that did that had been influenced by Tom Metzger and his crew and his TV shows. And what happened, he lost all his property because it went to court. Morris Dees actually came out here to present that case. So yeah, I think it's disheartening, and it can even be scary, but once again, we have to stand up. We can't stand down. You know, we need to let them know that you will not control us through fear and intimidation. And then we need to call on our law enforcement folks to make sure that they do what they need to do, even though we know that even in this city, we had somebody who's on the police force who is a Nazi sympathizer. So I thank you for your question. And it is what it is. That's just why we all got to be foot soldiers for justice. We got to be out there. We got to call it out. Absolutely.
Let me add a couple of comments. I don't think we're the same. We have the same issues maybe, but the landscape has changed. We don't have lynchings in the sense of mob rule. We have police actions that appear to be lynchings. Because the landscape has changed, it's not as clear cut. You know, you can see a mob, you can see illegal activities that result in a lynching. But with the police shooting, there's always a question of, was it legitimate? And the issue of, did the officer fear for his life? The real question is, was it reasonable for the officer to fear for his life? But that's not the way they phrase it. So I think the strategies that are needed today are more difficult to come by. They're subtle, they're not as overt as they used to be. I mean, issues used to be much more clearly defined. And at the same time, confusion comes in because some of us black people, are doing really well and are benefiting from this country in ways that groups of us had not done in the past, which just confuses the issue even more. Because then people will say, well, it's really not about race. It's about those people who are different from those other people who are the same people. So I just think that things are different, but they're still the same.
Hi, thanks for being here today and allowing me to ask this question. As a dreamer living in Oregon, I was wondering what the Hispanic Latino involvement was like during this the civil rights movement, and has it changed? Are we more involved, or how is it like? Thank you.
Well, in Portland itself, I don't know that there was much of a civil rights movement for Hispanic rights. Farm worker rights were going on, of course, during that period, but I don't know how much of that was directly in Portland. So I don't really know how to answer your question. Certainly they were comrades, and certainly I didn't buy grapes for a long time. For those of you who remember the grape strikes. But I don't know, and in fact, in those years, there were not the numbers we have now either that were in the city limits. So I don't really know how to answer that. Maybe you all can better.
Well, you're right that the bigger issues then were the farm communities, and those issues among the farm communities, of course, was housing standards. The wages were of issue. I can still remember because it was during the McCall administration, and we had actually required all state agency heads to be at the state fairgrounds where Greyhound buses was brought in and picked up people in poverty from all around the state so that they could tell the directors what the problems were rather than vice versa. And so, and I do remember the Brown Berets coming from California, and of course that was in the early 70s. But the issues then were housing and wages. Then they were organizing, and of course this past session we did pass the driver's license bill, so that the Dreamers won't be without their driver's license. Bilingual ed was being discussed in the early 70s, and because I was with the governor's office, and one of the things, and I didn't get my wish was that rather than that all Oregon students would be required to learn both languages.
So one of the things I want to say is that when we look at the civil rights movement, some people mark it, you know, during the time of Martin Luther King and the Montgomery bus boycott, and then later years, you know, there was the passage of the Civil Rights Act. One of the things that we need to recognize is that the activism and the struggle for civil rights by African Americans in the African American community and their allies gave rise to people saying, hey, we need to have some legislation too. So you look at the 1972 Title IX. We look at the bilingual education. We look at special ed. All of these came about on the heels of the civil rights movement, when people said, wait a minute, we got some issues that need to be addressed by the law. And when I came out here in 1969 to go to college, I'm gonna be honest with you, we weren't talking about grapes in New York. Seriously. But when I came out here, that's one of the first things that I became involved in, because people, a lot of my classmates were from California, and they talked about that, and so, like you, I wasn't eating grapes. And so I think that when we talk about issues related to DACA and to young people who are the dreamers, we are looking once again at a continuum of struggle and activism. One of the things I learned when I directed the Desegregation Assistance Center for this region for 20 years is that there was like a similar Brown v. Board of Education that came out of Texas, you know, where the Latino community was demanding justice for education for their children, very much the way that the Lau decision addressed what was not happening for Chinese American children who could not get instruction in their language. So we need to kind of celebrate the fact that the civil rights movement put some things out there in the public square that everybody could relate to in some way. You know, the women's movement. All of these things. Americans, especially Americans with Disability Act. So I think that, once again, by studying the civil rights movement and all the things that happened during that movement and after that movement would do us all well. And Richard, I did want to respond to your question, your comment about, you know, were there any women in the Black Panther Party? Yes, the Black Panther Party and women.
Of course, they were cooking those pancakes.
Okay, I'm through. No, it did exist, but I'm gonna share a little thing with you. Because I'm one of those sisters who was very involved in a lot of things, but I'm also one of those sisters who knew how to get things done and exert my power in ways that sometimes the guys didn't even know that they was being dealt with. But there's a quote someone said one time, "Black women are the only women in the world who can drive a car from the back seat." And I'd like to think of myself as a backseat driver. And you know, and the thing is, yeah, we do realize that black men have been demonized, put down. And so, you know, you give them a little space so that they can be the men that they are. And then there are times, believe it or not, you all may not understand this, but there are times when the sister said, "Now wait a minute, this is not how we need to do this." And the brothers will say, "Okay, well, okay, tell me." But you know, it happens. It happens everywhere. You know that, I mean, we're gonna talk about sexist behavior. Let's look at white males. Don't talk to us about black men. Let's look at white males and the domination that many of you have experienced, right? I'm done.
On that note, she's done. Hey, on that note, she's done. But I guess, you know, understanding that sister got your back.
Right.
Usually. But there are times when sister's patience runs oh so thin. But just know that in spite of it all, we're here. We're not going nowhere. And she said no. But I can't leave without saying this because I happen to have worked for both of these governors. The Indian Commission, which was the only one across this country that was created by Governor Vic Atia. And then following that was the Women's Commission. And you now have the Black Commission, the Hispanic Commission, the Asian Commission. So, and you have, and the developmentally disabled have their organization. So what you're going to find when I said that there's a place that if you have an issue or you have a desire to have to be engaged and involved, you can be. Because there is an advocacy group here for everyone if you want to become engaged and involved. I say that because we mentioned civil rights for most of the group, but we forgot the Asian group, the Asian population, and the internments.
Oh, yeah. And they were written into the laws.
And they were
as badly as we were.
Yes. You know, I often think that man's inhumanity to man doesn't know where he's going next. We're running out of time. You're telling me I have to be quiet and we're going to get out of here.
It is 9 o'clock. I want to pass it over to the host of this evening.
I've just been asked to make one announcement, which is that the original baseline essays are at the North Portland Library, so you can find them there, ask your librarian, and there are supplemental essays at the Central Library, and also thank you.
Thank you.